Well, thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody out there. Happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, something that I know everybody loves. Makes pen testers, red teamers sit at the edge of their seat and jump for joy. It is the common vulnerability scoring system. I don't have any real time feedback, so I assume everybody is jumping up and down and super excited and cheering and applauding because this is such a super exciting topic, right? No. Okay. Right. I get it. We'll try and make it fun though. But a little bit about me before we begin. My name is Alex Hoffman, or RedWedgeX. I'm a pen tester, red teamer at Viasat, ham radio enthusiast. I'm a father, a D&D player, dungeon master, 15-year U.S. Army vet. I'm on the staff at CactusCon and admin at the VetCon Discord. And if I do say so myself, an all-around great guy. I'm going to go ahead and throw out the obligatory presentation and opinions are my own and have not been approved or vetted by my not been approved or vetted by my employer. All right, so let's get into the common vulnerability scoring system. The common vulnerability scoring system is a free and open industry standard that's designed to measure the severity of a vulnerability and take into account risk. It's currently on version 3.1, but it was originally released in 2005. It's a tool that's useful for security professionals, infosec people, pen testers, red teamers, blue teamers, even sysadmins, network administrators. I'm going to teach you why today, because it really is a great tool, and it's more than you probably realize when you think about CVSS. As a pen tester, I use CVSS to provide accurate, measurable findings to my customers. As a defender, use it to understand risk as it applies to your environment, triage important findings. As a system administrator or network administrator, you can use it to prioritize patching or understand ways to reduce residual risk using the temporal and environmental scoring that we'll talk about later. Through the talk, I'll be using the screenshots from the calculator, the CVSS calculator on first.org. I'll throw a link up at the end, but feel free to just Google if you want to follow along, CVSS 3.1 calculator. So when you think of CVSS, I'm sure everybody in the room thinks about these things. These are called qualitative severity rankings, and that's the low, medium, high critical findings. You've probably seen these on the top of every pen test report or security center findings and expose findings, along with the CVSS score of 0 to 10. What's important to know is there's more to it than just that. The qualitative severity rankings are great because they look awesome on the top of an executive summary. They brief well in slides to leadership, but there's more to CVSS than just the number. And just taking into account the number, if I tell you something's a 9.6 critical, that sounds bad, but it doesn't really give you an understanding of why it sounds bad. So the most important part about CVSS is the CVS vector string. So the vector string looks like this. And this is a line that tells you everything you need to know about that vulnerability, why it's bad for you, and how can it affect you more so than just that 9.8 number. Like I said, it's a text representation of the severity of the metrics. It's commonly used to record or transfer CVSS metrics in a concise form. What's cool about this is you can actually copy that entire string as it is, go to the CVSS calculator, put a pound sign at the end of the URL, paste that in, press enter, and now you've got the calculator loaded with those findings. So it's a standardized way of looking at it. So I was thinking about it. I was playing Dungeons and Dragons at work last year during lunch, and I finished playing and went back to my office and started writing a pen test report. And it dawned on me that this is so similar to a D&D stats block. You know, if I take that same format and put something like that up on the screen, if you're a D&D player, you know what that means, right? You got Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition, your character's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. That's a stats block. That's how you play the game. And it dawned on me that CVSS is so similar to that. So what I want to do now is I want to take everybody through let's just say a D&D adventure, but using CVSS as our character sheet. How does that sound? All right, cool. So let's introduce our character. His name is Confluentus. He is a dwarf bard, historian, and capable fighter who travels the realm adventuring and thirsting for knowledge, combat, and a good cup of Java. So I'm going to go ahead and take off my InfoSec presenter hat and put on my Dungeon Master hat and introduce our story so far. Our hero, Confluentus, has wandered the land of Internetia for 15 years. He has traversed the sub-oceanic lightways, the series of elven tubes, and has ventured beyond the stars and back. He has collected vast libraries of knowledge, and the monks of the DevOps monastery in the land of Jira have taken him as their foretold champion. But today, he faces his greatest threat yet. He ventures far from home to a place feared by professionals. Today, he encounters the tomb of Zero Day. Confluentus triumphantly storms from room to room, destroying all that stand in his way. He stands tall, uninjured, and undamaged. He feels it. He knows he must be close. The prize will be his. The cloak of invulnerability must be through this last door. He bursts in and finds himself face to face with our villain, Crypto Kid 666. Who is this? We don't know. Could be a chaotic neutral kid just trying to see what he can see. Could be a lawful evil state actor, or a corporate entity with nefarious intentions trying to bring glory to her homeland or raise stock prices. Who knows? Crypto Kid 666 quickly thumbs through a spell book, a wry smile creeping across thin lips. In a long dead language, the words flow, casting the ancient spell of CVE 2019-3396. Confluence server before 6.6.12, I achieve path traversal via server-side template injection weakness in your widget connector component. Confluentus feels weak and falls to his knees. Crypto Kid rolls for damage. All right, so stepping back a bit, let's talk about the attack roll. This is the base score section of the calculator. These scores are typically set by whoever's publishing the CVE, whether that's the producer of the software that the vulnerability is found in, or the the finder, whoever produced the CVE. So the base score doesn't change. That's the important thing to know about base metrics. The base score takes the entire vulnerability in a vacuum, doesn't take into account your specific use case, network protections at your corporate level, anything else other than in a base level, this is what the score is. So these, like I said, these are typically set beforehand. So let's talk about some of these specifically. I'm not going to read the entire slide because nobody likes that, but I'm going to use it, to talk about it a little bit. The attack vector is how the attacker will get to the vulnerability. Anywhere from physical, which is someone has to physically be touching the machine. An attacker has to be on the box. Up to network, which is like a wide area network up to and including the internet. So if it's accessible on the internet, it's a network level attack. Then there's adjacent network and local networks, which break that down further. Attack complexity. These are things beyond the attacker's control that have to exist. So for example, a man in the middle is considered a high complexity attack because it requires a lot of other steps to be able to do. Additionally, another great example is when a component in the software has to be configured a certain way or running a certain plugin for the attack to be valued, for that attack to work. That's considered high complexity because the attacker can't control whether or not that plugin is enabled. Privileges required. This is what level the attacker has to have before getting into the box. So when we talk about no privileges required, this is your true remote code execution on a website. You don't need to be logged in. You don't need to be authenticated, anything like that. Low is you have to have basically have a user shell or you have to have user access. So things like local privilege escalation are typically low privilege required. High privilege required. Typically things like administrator root credentials are required before you can exploit this vulnerability. User interaction, the requirement that a user does something other than the attacker. So if there is something that needs to be clicked on or opened or run by a user who is not the attacker, that's user interaction required. Otherwise, it's none. Scope is one of the more convoluted ones, the harder ones to understand in these metrics. The scope is whether is changed or unchanged based on if one component impacts resources in a different component beyond its security scope. So when you think of scope change in a pen test world, you typically think, well, I attacked this box. I have a shell on this box, and this box now gives me access to another network. That's a scope change. Not really in CVSS world. Scope change, you have to take into account the single security authority. So you think about an Active Directory domain. If you pwn an Active Directory controller, you own that entire security authority. But if you use those creds to pwn every box in that network, it's not a change in scope because you have not changed security scopes. A good example of this working when it would be changed is something like a cross-site scripting attack, where the target of the attack, the vulnerable component, is the web server, but the target is the user who visits the site or clicks a link. That's a scope change because you've moved from attacking a web server to attacking a user who is not controlled by that web server. I hope that makes sense. It's this is the one that gets most people tripped up. And then impact metrics. I'm not going to delve too much in depth on this because InfoSec people, we know what confidentiality, integrity, availability is. But this is the impact of those. Does it impact confidentiality, integrity, availability, high, low, or none? So bringing that back to our attack situation and that CVE we talked earlier, the attack vector is network because it's on the internet. It's low complexity. There's no privileges required. Does not require user interaction. The scope is unchanged because it does not allow us, exploiting this vulnerability does not allow us to access a different security scope. It's a high confidentiality impact, integrity, and availability impact. And so when you calculate that out, that brings us to a 9.8 critical, which is where we're starting. But let's jump back into our story for a few minutes. Confluentus feels the exploit land its crushing blow, penetrating his outer armor and executing itself deep into the host operating system. He calls out to his maker, praying for help. O great and beautiful Atlasia, bless me and heal me, protect me from this evil, chat with my hip and turn your gaze of your fisheye upon your faithful servant, intervene on my behalf and stride down to my side, O great and powerful collaborator. Suddenly, a light shines down from above. Confluentus feels the healing word of official fix as his creator, Atlasia, blesses him. It's coming, he hears in a whisper. Hold strong, child, for the patch will be applied after testing. All right, so that brings us to the temporal scores. As the name suggests, these are specific factors related to a vulnerability at a specific point in time. So we talked about how the base scores will never change. The temporal scores change based on the situation of when you're writing it up. So let's go through each of these, and that'll make a whole lot more sense. Exploit code maturity. This is the likelihood that the exploit exists in the wild and is easy to exploit. Not just is it being exploited in the wild, but how easy is it for an attacker to get their hands on the code is a great example of this. An unproven vulnerability means that there is no available code. There's no available exploit code. A proof of concept is exactly what it sounds like. There may be a YouTube video of somebody doing it, but there's not necessarily released code. Functional code is I can go on GitHub and find an exploit that with a little bit of tweaking I can make work. And high maturity is there's a Metasploit module that comes prepackaged with Metasploit as an example. Remediation level is the availability of options. Now, what's interesting about this one specifically, but temporal metrics in general, is you don't have to have that exploit code for exploit code maturity. You don't have to have installed the patch for remediation level to work. It is based on, is it available? Even just having it available lowers the score, whether it's an official fix, a temporary fix, a workaround, or if there's not one. Those change the score just because there is a fix somewhere. And the report confidence is the degree of confidence in the existence of the vulnerability. Is this truly a confirmed vulnerability in the system? Is it reasonable to assume that it's vulnerable, or do we just not know? So bringing it back to our specific case, there is an official fix. And you'll see that brought that down from a 9.8 to a 9.4. So just the fact that it has an official fix makes it less critical. It's still critical, but it makes it less critical. And again, you can see as I'm going through, I've got the CVSS vector strings on the bottom. Again, you could paste that right into the calculator and get exactly what I'm looking at. But all is still not well. Confluentus is damaged and broken, weak and on his knees, barely able to stand. The blessing from his maker helped a bit, but he's still in critical condition. He is not long for this world. He feels the imminent shutdown of his functions and his denial of his service. But then, just as his eyes close, he sees his friends approaching in the distance. Hold the line, Cisco Flamehand screams as she casts Firewall, segregating Confluentus from the internet. We just need to hold out until the patch army arrives, Docker bellows, enveloping Confluentus in a container, making host exploitation more complex. Arachne Bluecoat chitters inside her spider speak, weaving a proxy web between the party and the enemy, protecting them from accidentally accessing any malicious locations on the battlefield. And that brings us to the environmental scores. Remember, we talked about the base scores never change and that temporals change based on situation at a given time. Environmental changes are based on specific use case, environment, and implementation of the product. This is your chance as an analyst or as a defender or whatever you are to be able to take into account your specific situation. I can't tell you how many times companies I've worked for have contracted a third-party testing firm or looked at Tenable results and it says 10.0 critical and everybody's running around with their hair on fire. And you look at it and it's like, it's the database that holds last week's menus in the cafe, right? And everyone's like, this is a 10.0, but it is that we need to find a better way to think about this because it's not that big of a deal and we should triage it lower. So that's where the environmental scores come into play, is it allows you to change the CVSS score based on your specific situation, you know? I'm gonna go through this and like one more time, the environmental scores change based on the specific situation where the base scores never change. So the first half of the environmental scores is the security requirements. These metrics enable analysts to customize the CVSS score. This is your ability to say how big of a deal is the impact on confidentiality, integrity, availability. So like I said earlier, if you think about the case of the database holding last week's cafe menus, it is still considered a high probability of loss of confidentiality, say, but I can modify this here by saying that it is a low requirement for confidentiality. It's not a big deal if these menus get pwned. So I'm going to change the confidentiality loss requirement to low, and that lowers the score because it's not as big of a deal from a business perspective. The other things we can do is the modified base metrics. This allows you to change the base metrics based on your current situation. For example, if it is in the base score, if you've got a network as your attack vector, but this site is only available on your intranet, you can lower that to adjacent network because your specific case brings that down. One of the things I want to point out is, other than the base scores, none of these are required. The temporal and the environmental scores, if you do not have a need to change them, just leave them as not defined. Otherwise, your vector string will get super long if you just have them copy the existing ones. So in our specific situation, we reduced the attack vector to adjacent network, and we've lowered the confidentiality requirements, and we've modified the attack complexity to make it high. And check that out. We have lowered the overall severity from a 9.8 critical when we started to a 6.9 medium. So you know what's really cool about this? Put yourself in the mind of an IT professional, say a systems engineer, a network engineer. You get past this vulnerability, right? Someone sends you this vulnerability as a 9.8 or whatever. Is my alarm going off? I'm sorry. Okay, so someone sends you this vulnerability as a 9.8, and you can then use the environmental scores to find better ways other than just patching to reduce the residual risk. Like we talked about, you can put it in behind a firewall or modify the attack complexity, change the confidentiality requirements. Those kind of things will allow you as an IT professional to determine the best path forward. Wow. I hope you all can't hear that, but my alarm is going off. I am sorry. All right. The army has arrived, and they've brought with them the patch. This holy object, when applied to Confluentus, protects him from the evil of CVE 2019-3396. They make quick work of Crypto Kid 666, who falls to the ground defeated. For now. All right, so takeaways. CVSS isn't just an overall score and a pretty qualitative severity ranking. Being able to understand the entire vector string helps you get a better understanding of the vulnerability. And like I said, IT professionals can use this to calculate better ways to protect your vulnerable systems in the interim. And here's the CVSS calculator link. And that's pretty much it for me. I want to thank everybody who attended the talk, especially thanks to Digital Overdose Con for putting this on. I can be reached on Twitter, Discord, GitHub, or email at RedWedgeX pretty much everywhere. I'll put these slides up if anyone wants them on my GitHub later today. I'll create a repo called SlideShare. But I'll go ahead and take questions, and I appreciate everybody's time.
That was such a badass talk. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for giving that. That was by far the most entertaining like story I've ever heard. I was cracking up so much during that. I like my Zoom was like, "Hey, you're muted, by the way." It was great. Thank you for doing that. I think we have a couple questions for you.
Absolutely. Let's see what we've got.
Alrighty, first question. How would you break down a CVSS for a non-D&D player who doesn't understand?
Absolutely. The big thing to look about CVSS is pretty much taking into account the calculator. Trying to go back to an earlier slide here. The vector string really is the important thing. And if you put this side by side up against like looking at the calculator, you can really see that when you learn to read this, scope unchanged, attack vector network, attack complexity low, privileges required high, user interaction none. If you can read the CVS vector string, then you get a better understanding of the vulnerability itself. Even just popping it into a calculator and seeing what it looks like on the calculator. Try and find that slide like this. This is what it would look like when you click on things on the calculator on first.org's site. You're able to really understand, and it's not obviously a D&D thing by default, but I think that was a good way to kind of make it fun understanding. But in general, just looking at the scores from more than just the number, looking at the actual metrics themselves gives you a better idea of understanding the vulnerability.
Right. I had a question for you specifically on, you mentioned that sometimes you see these scores at the top of reports that are handed to, a CXX, et cetera, and it looks nice, right? It doesn't mean much. Does that sometimes, do you feel that might bias some executives that are just like, oh yeah, this is, I don't know, like a 7, it's not critical. And like the entire IT staff is like, yes, but do you feel that there is such a dynamic that is that has a tendency in the industry?
Absolutely. And I think that is why relying on the base scores only is a problem. Because if Tenable or Nexpose or any of my tools spit out a 9.8 and I throw it on a slide, the same as is, then that's not giving the full picture. That's why the environmental scores are so important, because it allows you as the professional making that determination to determine how big of a deal it really is. Because you can modify those scores. I've been in companies where they make up their own local scoring rankings. So they say CVSS doesn't give me a clear picture. And it's because they're not realizing that you can change the scores yourself as the analyst for emphasis or de-emphasis. If something comes out as a medium, but you as the analyst say, this is super important, this is a big deal, that's when you can run in the environmental scores and pump up the numbers. Now, you shouldn't arbitrarily just throw up numbers to make them look higher, but using them correctly, you do get a better picture. And I'm not saying CVSS version 3 isn't flawed. There are some people, including myself, who see some of the metrics that get spit out and go, that is not as high as it should be, or vice versa. But it's a standard, industry standard starting point.
Awesome. And well, I guess as a follow-up, do you feel that this has worked kind of bring InfoSec people, I guess, from all over the world together on a general comprehension of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think that CVSS being it is pretty much the industry standard. There are other frameworks out there to determine it, like Dread and a few others, I believe. But in general, being able to have a standard set of understanding of the vulnerabilities. I mean, that's why if you go Google a CVE right now, it's going to have a CVSS score. If you look at any tooling that's doing automated vulnerability scan, it's using CVSS. And the reason is because it's an industry standard worldwide.
Okay.
Awesome. And another question, I don't think this one was answered, is, wait, did you grab Ghost Protocols, Atomic?
I did not.
Okay, so yeah. How much subjectivity comes into the later variables like environmental? Has it ever been enough to cause conflict over priorities with your colleagues over what should be handled when?
Absolutely. Yeah. And because it's up to the analyst to make the determination on the environmental scores, it can cause confusion. And that's why the person doing the analysis needs to have a good understanding of the environment. If you bring in a third-party pen test firm and they do a quick pen test and then give you your scores, that's where instead of just briefing their report, somebody inside the company who has a detailed understanding needs to be able to say, this is this is this because, and add the environmental scores. Don't always rely on your testers to add the environmental scores. InfoSec defenders or blue teamers or even IT professionals are there because they know their environment. And being able to have those people have input on the environmental scores makes it more of a holistic approach and more accurate. So yeah, there have been times when I've argued with people over a score, and it can create a false sense of security where something looks like a medium, but it should be a critical, or something's a critical and it comes out as critical and should be a medium. And that's really where the analysis work happens. I talk a lot in my job about automated tools and automated tools and report generation and things that spit out reports are great. But if you use a tool like Faraday, and I'm not talking about Faraday, I use it and I love it, but it's just going to create a report of the findings. It's not going to do the analysis for you. And maybe that's another talk up there for is actually how to analyze the finding. But the analysis is so important and so overlooked when all you're doing is spitting out the name of a CVE, the QSR, and step-by-step walkthrough. Really understanding what the vulnerability is super important.
Awesome.
Yeah,
do we have anything else?
Thank you so much. No, I think that was the last question. We really appreciate you taking your time to come and present this for us. It was so much fun. I loved it. I think you've had nothing but great feedback coming in. So good job. Thank you for such an entertaining and informative presentation today.
Happy to be here. And thanks for putting this on.
Of course.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.